Greetings. Thank you all for joining us for this very important discussion about the war in Ukraine through the eyes of Svoboda. My name is Nadia McConnell. I'm president of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. Before we go to this very important topic, I want to express our condolences to all those that are suffering the devastation of the Hurricane Ian. Looking at the videos and hearing the reports, any number of reporters have said that it looks like a war zone. And of course, immediately my thoughts go, but there are war zones. There is a war zone, and that is in Ukraine. We are very fortunate to have today's speakers because a lot of the discussion about the war is on the military side, about land liberated or taken, very important discussions. But there are other dimensions to Putin's war against Ukraine that doesn't get as a steady coverage or discussion. And it is as important as the reporting on the military posture of the war. So today we have with us Maryana Drach, who is the director of RFE-RL Ukraine Service, overseeing the service and award-winning coverage of the country. She provided the award-winning coverage of Ukraine's 2013-2014 Maidan, the Revolution of Dignity, and developments since. Under her watch, the service has launched the impactful as well as a multimedia on anti-corruption reporting project called Schemes, Corruption in Details, as well as multimedia program efforts for the residents of Russia-annexed Crimea, Realities, and war-torn Eastern Ukraine, Donbas.Realities. A native of Kyiv, Maria joined the service in 1996. I must note that she is the daughter of two major leaders of Ukraine's civil society, the late Ivan Drach and her mother, Maria Drach. She got a degree from Rosa University and holds a graduate degree from public administration from the Institute of Public Administration and Local Government in Ukraine. Joining Maryana is Tetiana Iakubovych. She's a journalist and editor of Donbas.Realities. Tetiana works at Radio Svoboda since 2015. She is the author of multimedia reports, Submarine Army, Mind Valley, and Those Who Rock the City. She's editor of projects of like Our Donbas and Mind 360, which looks through the eyes of a miner, a host of broadcasts from frontline cities, and director of radio film Donbas 91, and a documentary film, My Shift, which is about nuclear plant operators of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Our two guests are not only very well informed and knowledgeable about the current situation, but they have been tracking developments for many years. And so they are uniquely, I think, qualified to talk about the current situation as it has developed from the early years of Putin's aggression towards Ukraine. Maryana, welcome. And first, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Nadia, and thank you very much for attending this session. It's an honor for me to be here. You mentioned that I graduated the university in the US, and I remember in early days in 1990s how US-Ukraine Foundation was starting its activities. I am very happy to see how active you are today as well. First, a few words about who we are. RFE-RL is funded by US Congress, by a US Agency for Global Media, and by law we have to provide objective and independent reporting. our newsroom, the newsroom of RFERL, including the newsroom of the Ukrainian Service, just won a prestigious online journalism award in the category of breaking news, large newsroom, for covering Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And at great personal risk, our correspondents provide information from front lines. We also use latest technology to verify and geolocate videos and analyze satellite imagery to break both Russian troop movements and also human rights abuses. And in Ukraine, just last week, our journalists won two major awards. One, the award is called Honor of the Profession, and one in the category of breaking news for frontline reporting, and the second in the investigative news category. So I'm very proud of my colleagues. This war is, of course, cost a lot for all Ukrainians, and the humanitarian cost is immense. Thousands of people were killed, countless homes and buildings are destroyed in the country. Many families are displaced. And I have to mention that many Ukrainian journalists are covering this war, and some of them went to front lines. Some were affected by this war as civilians. And according to local media watchdogs, as of today, around 40 journalists were killed in Ukraine. And one of them is my colleague, Vera Hirich. She was killed in her house in Kyiv after a Russian missile strike hit residential building where she lived. And that was at the end of April, at the day when UN Secretary General visited the Ukrainian capital. And I would like to show everybody a story that our colleague produced. It was the last story that she covered. It was about the siege of Mariupol. And she found a woman that never appeared to the media before, and that woman survived Holocaust, and that woman helped to build Mariupol. Mariupol is a city which before the war had around 400,000 people. Now it is completely destroyed. According to the Ukrainian authorities, more than 90% of all buildings have been destroyed in the city. And let's watch that video.
Лучше бы это был фейк, вы понимаете? А не такая правда. Когда я услышала, что российские войска могут вторгнуться, вернее, не могут, а уже приказ, что и мирным жителям не надо волноваться, там вот какие-то точечные удары на кого-то будут, на военные там, а тут я пришла в ужас. Началась блокада, все, город закрыли, как Ленинград. Только намного страшнее. Они стреляли 48 часов в сутки. А вы как думаете? День за два. И бомбы, когда летят, у них свой писк. И когда они падают и взрываются, и земля дыбом, и осколки веером. Военные не знают, как себя вести. Мирные жители. Это будет главная цель. Так оно и получилось. Эльвира Михайловна, у меня нет ни детей, ни внуков, потому что когда формировался мой, простите, женский организм, я была в Холокосте, и ничего не сформировалось толком. Поэтому та война лишила меня возможности иметь детей. Так вот, только с моей фамилией Борц закопано у агробазы города Мариуполя 38 расстрелянных по графе 5 национальность. Они были повинны в том, что у них такая национальность. А сколько было таких же моих близких родственников, но с другой фамилией, целая книга. И все вот эти дома в городе Мариуполе через мои руки прошли, а теперь их все разбили. Знаете, в Мариуполе очень запечатлелось Приморский бульвар. Красивая, прямая, светлая улица и лавочки для отдыхающих. И на одной такой лавочке присел человек, и ему снарядом разнесло вот так лицо, снесло, счесало. И он сидел несколько дней. Эти парни, которые там все это время сражались, пытаясь это как-то остановить. И сейчас они возрастали, последний час. Господи, спаси их всех. Ты же сам, господин Путин, все время говорил о том, что в каждой стране свои законы, свои обычаи. И что ты сделал? И что ты сейчас сделал? На твоих руках уже получилось столько крови, что этому уже прощения просто никакой Господь даже не позволит. Мы все как бы свидетели вот этого массового убийства граждан соседней страны. И мы не имеем права молчать, иначе мы соучастники этого убийства. Всех. Понимаете? Ну, не знаю. Я не знаю, что еще можно добавить. Господин Путин, подумайте, прекратите эту бойню.
Maryana, thank you so much for that.
Nadia, I would like to continue, if I may,
Please.
I would like to touch the subject about what is happening on the ground and what our journalists are seeing. And the journalists that covered the war since 2014, they say that they never seen atrocities like that. The same we hear also from human rights organizations that are working on the ground. And we, in my view, were well positioned to cover the full-fledged invasion of Russia because we have special projects that cover Crimea, that cover Donbas, which is eastern Ukraine. Also recently, we launched a new regional hyper-local project that covers southern Ukraine and the Azov Sea area. It is called News of Azov. So just before full-fledged Russian invasion, we hired new correspondents in such cities as Mariupol. They had to flee because of the shellings because of what was happening on the ground. But even though we were preparing for something like this, but we did not expect that Russia will be shelling civilian objects and that our correspondents would see what they saw. And I would tell you about our correspondents that travel to different Ukrainian towns and villages and speak to local residents. One of them is Tetiana Iakubovych, and he decided to uncover the situation that happened in one of the villages of Kyiv region. It is called Andriivka. First, he learned about several civilians that died in that village, and eventually he was able to track 14 people that died during 1 month of Russian occupation of that village in the Kyiv region. And 14 people died because of bombardment or because of Russian atrocities. And at least 2 people died because they did not receive medical help on time. And this is just one village in Ukraine. Before the war, it had around 1,000 residents. So we can project the story of that village to Ukraine at large, which was occupied. And imagine if something like this happened during 1 month. We know that we produced a map locator and providing a personal story and speaking to witnesses of these real Ukrainian citizens that died because of this Russian aggression. And we speak also to people that never seen maybe journalists before. For instance, our correspondents worked in Kherson region in southern Ukraine, and they came to villages in Kherson region that were liberated by the Ukrainian troops, and they spoke to our correspondents to describe their experience there. And we as media work on different platforms. We are on TV, on radio, and also on digital platforms in Ukraine. So we try to share such stories across various platforms. And also, there is also a case when one of the Russian military was convicted in absentia after our reporting. Our correspondent who was working at the front lines found some documents from the Russian military member of the tank crew, and our investigative journalists were able to track that person, and Ukrainian authorities decided to launch a criminal case against him. They spoke to local villagers, and they said that he was directing, he was giving orders to shoot into civilians. And last week, that Russian military was tried and convicted in absentia. So this is something which happens, that Ukrainian authorities react in this way. They would like to get testimonies from journalists. Also, we were reporting about sexual crimes committed by the Russian military in the Kyiv region. Of course, we are very careful talking about such stories, protecting women. And in that specific case, our correspondent spoke to one of the international organizations which was investigating Russian crimes in the country. And I can tell you that what is happening now in Ukraine before the full-fledged invasion, that we actually understood that something like this might be coming in terms of repressions against civilians, against Ukrainians, and against people with active position. And also including journalists, because in Crimea, and we cover Crimea since 2014, in the middle of February, our colleague, Vlad Yasipenko, was charged for alleged possession and transport of explosives. he was charged to 6 years in prison for being a journalist, and he said that he was tortured before he acknowledged that he had explosives. So something like this, the pressure on continued and has started again against Ukrainians after occupation of Crimea and in different parts of Donbas in eastern Ukraine. And we speak to other journalists in the newly occupied territories. For instance, we spoke with a journalist from Kherson region, Oleg Baturin, and he after his contacts with the occupation authorities, he had 4 broken ribs, and there were a lot of threats how he would die in agony. Also, we spoke to another journalist, and I'm just mentioning the cases of journalists, but imagine there are like many other cases against civilians that maybe are not necessarily ready to speak with the media. And that case really struck me. It was the case of the journalist Svetlana Zalizhetska from Melitopol, and her father was abducted, the father in mid-70s. And the occupying forces wanted to get an access to her media outlet. So they abducted her father. So she decided eventually, of course, to give up the rights to the web resource. So this is something which is happening every day at the occupied and newly occupied territories of Ukraine. And I'm mentioning these examples just to say that we clearly see ongoing repressions, ongoing threats, and in addition to bombing of civilian residents, we see continuous threats on active members of society. And in Crimea, I mentioned the case of our colleague, Vlad Yasipenko, who was tortured, and he was tried and sentenced by Russia-imposed court. And there is the new sentence, which happened literally last week. It's about the case of the famous Crimean Tatar activist and journalist Nariman Jalal, who was sentenced to 17 years behind bar on sabotage charges. And he and international monitors and human rights activists say that such charges are politically motivated. So on the one hand, we have ongoing war, and on the other hand, we have to be mindful of repressions that are taking place not only across Ukraine, when Ukrainians have to hide during air raid sirens, and regular life is disrupted when residential buildings are bombed across the countries in such cities like Kharkiv. But also we have to be mindful of repressions that are taking place in Crimea. And I would like to ask Tetiana to maybe add her thoughts about this.
Thank you, Maryana, and thank you all for your interest to Ukraine and to our work. You know, despite I have been working with the topics connected to Eastern Ukraine and to war for about 6 years, of course, I didn't expect such scale of war, and we all live in new reality now. Of course, I'm happy when people all over the world want to know more about the real situation here. And I'd like to continue with questions of deportation and forced mobilization, because these are two biggest problems for those Ukrainians who live near the war zone and especially in occupied territories. It is difficult to establish the exact number of deported Ukrainian citizens, but to understand the scale of this problem, we can use 2 figures. Deputy Prime Minister of Ukrainian government, Olga Stefanishina, says that about 1.5 million Ukrainians cannot return from Russia to Ukraine now. The United Nations organization says about 2 million people, and Russian side says about more than 2 million Ukrainians who left Ukraine and came to Russia. They call it evacuation. And we know, of course, that some of these people were transported to Russia forcibly. How it happened? First variant is when military didn't give people another exit rate, another way. Their cities were heavily shelled and it was already impossible to stay there. So people decided to use this variant that suggested Russian side and moved to Russia. And the second situation was when people were directly threatened. We know such cases from many interviews. For example, when Russian soldiers said, we will blow up this house in the basement of which you are sitting, so evacuate if you want. And people were forced to go with Russians. Another cases we heard from people in Hostomel. If you know, it is northern part of Ukraine near Kiev, and this small city was under occupation for about 2 months. And some people, after liberation, after these territories were liberated, they were found in Belarus. And it turned out that they didn't want to evacuate there, but they had no choice. So when people enter the territory of Russia, if they have successfully went through filtration, they have to decide what to do, to stay there or to leave. And according to human rights activists, getting from the territory of Russia to, for example, Estonian border may cost from 3,000 to 8,000 euros. It depends on the place where people is situated, because of course Russia is a big country, and some trains brought people even to the far north, to the city of Nakhodka. It is very far from Europe, and in fact people need to cross all Asian continent to become free. So such forced deportation, according to my observation, was more characteristic for March, April, maybe May, and later Russia opened a more or less permanent passage through Ukrainian checkpoint in the small village of Vasilievka in Zaporizhia region. And till September, people were generally able to leave occupied areas through this checkpoint. I know many people who used this way and everything was okay, but last week problems began in this Vasilievka checkpoint because Russia started mobilization. And now men younger than 35 years old cannot more cross this checkpoint. And now the one way they have, it is a way through Crimea and then Russian territory. Human rights activists call people to use this way, but in fact, we do not know if they will be able to cross Russian-Estonian border then, because now from the Russian point of view, these people are Russian citizens and maybe they will close this way. We don't know situation right now. And the another part is about forced mobilization. It is important and it is closely connected with the question of how to leave occupied territories, because many people, they appeared in such a rape. They are Ukrainian citizens, but they cannot leave captured territories, and now they can appear in Russian area. Until September, Kremlin carried out mobilization only in Donetsk and Luhansk region, and this did not apply to Kherson and Zaporizhia. And according to Ukrainian intelligence, there is almost no young male population in Donetsk and Luhansk. But as journalists, I can say that many young men, they still are hiding from mobilization. It looks strange, but some people, they didn't go far from their homes for half a year. So they really sit in their flats and are looking outdoors, where is military, where is patrol, who catch men, and how to avoid this. It is a real situation. Besides that, there are chat groups in Telegram of different cities where young men exchange with information where are these patrols of military and where they catch people. In addition, there was no order of mobilization. It was quite chaotic, and in some periods, even sick people or people with many children, they were mobilized. Then came period when we don't know why, but it was allowed to leave territory for men, and some men escaped in this way. And it changed step by step. Now Kremlin started this mobilization also in the new occupied territories of Zaporizhia and Kherson region, and it happened very quickly. So in fact, people had maybe 1 or 2 days to decide what to do, and now we see the checkpoint is already closed. If these people will not be able to leave through Crimea and Russian territory, they will appear in very scary situation in this rape, and the only way to save themselves will be surrender. Ukraine has an algorithm how people can report that they want to surrender, and then Ukrainian forces will meet these people. But of course, you understand that this is a big risk for them, and you need to have much information how to do that. And the last point is about filtration. Maryana said, and maybe you know, it is quite a popular topic that Russia is organizing filtration process for Ukrainians in the occupied territory. We do not know the exact number of people who went through these filtration camps. Ukrainian government said that about 16,000 people went through filtration and then escaped to Europe and came back to Ukraine. But of course, it is not a whole number of people. And what is filtration for people who live in these occupied areas? From the Russian point of view, their idea is that all residents of this territory need to go through filtration, because it is like checking who is dangerous for Ukraine, for Russian government, who maybe was a soldier of Ukrainian army or who held pro-Ukrainian rallies. So all people, it is several million, they need to go through filtration. But in fact, of course, if you are hiding and you don't move far from home, you don't cross border, maybe you can avoid this for some time. And what is filtration? In fact, it is some rooms, it could be administrative buildings or sport halls or camps where people are gathered for a very long time. It could be several weeks and even more than 1 month, without normal, as usual, without normal living conditions, without good medicine, and they wait for filtration. Then they had conversation with a specialist of FSB, Russian officer of security service. And then they ask this person, they take fingerprints, check tattoos, they are looking for patriotic or Ukrainian tattoos. And even we have facts from eyewitness when they ask little children if their parents tell the truth, when they really asked the children who were with their parents, really, does your mom gather with friends on weekend, and other strange situation. And the fate of those who didn't go through filtration is mostly unknown. Witnesses say that some people were taken away from the quiz, but it is impossible to trace what happened later. Maybe these are some prisons or executions for them, or maybe some of them were liberated, but it is impossible to know exactly.
If I may.
You have a video, I think you have a video about testimony regarding filtration.
Yes, I would like to show, yes, and I would like to ask also Tanya to turn on her video, because I guess there was a technical glitch because there was no video when she was speaking. I would like, if I may, Nadia, to show 2 videos that will show the work of our reporters in the field, and maybe first about filtration, if I would like to ask you to show the video, the testimony of a young woman that was held captive, and she was first hiding in Mariupol, and then she would show. We would see her testimony about filtration.
Okay.
Пропало грудне молоко, на жаль, і я вже почала його годувати сумішю. А для того, щоб робити, вже до нас до автобуса приєдналися російські солдати з автоматами, і ми повинні були їхати разом із ними аж до селища Безім'яне, до фільтраційного табору. І там вже нас чекали вже військові жінки російські та ДНР. Вони наказали нам роздягнутися, повністю знати все, навіть білизну. В них були гумові рукавиці, гумові перчатки, якими вони нас обшукували. Вони усі частини тіла вони їх торкалися, і це було одні гумові перчатки на усіх дівчат. Це був дійсно справжній шок для нас. Ми перевіряли наші відбитки пальців, взяли повністю всі відбитки, повністю уся ладонь, і нас фотографували у профіль та анфас. Ну, тобто таке відчуття, що ми злочинці, воно було присутнє, на жаль. В них є така база даних військових українських, вони побачили мене, побачили, що там є мій чоловік. І коли мене опитував звичайно військовий російський, до мене зліва вже підсів представник ФСБ і почав таке ж паралельне опитування. Мене питали стосовно того, які татуювання є у мого чоловіка, чи я можу якусь інформацію надати. Мені казали, що для мене краще буде сказати усю правду, сказати все про чоловіка, бо інакше там я можу страждати або будуть жертви. Тобто такий психологічний пресинг, він був присутній. Ну, я знаю, що також іншим жінкам вони навіть казали, що пришлють голову їх чоловіків у ящику.
And I would have to say that this is a typical testimony. The women that we spoke with often say that this is the quote that repeats itself, that we will send heads of your husband in a box. And we recorded dozens of testimonies of people that went through filtration. Some of these people refused to be on video, so they're only text stories with no names. And we also spoke to people that fled to the European Union countries via Russia. And so this is an ongoing story, because even today we spoke with one of the Ukrainian officials from Kherson region, and he said that the process of filtration has intensified. And in his view, if before the people that were subject to filtration were like activists or people that had strong views, right now anybody can be caught on the street in Kherson region, which is the parts which are controlled by Russian occupying forces and subjected to filtration. So Tetiana is absolutely right, saying that people are now hiding from mobilization and hiding, if they don't want to go to another region, hiding from filtration. And also, this is something which is, we heard the testimony of this young woman who described how women were stripped and then checked with the same, rubber gloves. This is something which is extremely shocking for many women that had to go through this. And so such stories, in my view, are very important. And this is something which is continues in Ukraine. And Tetiana also mentioned different figures that are mentioned by the Ukrainian government, by the Russian government. And I agree that there is no precise figure of how many Ukrainians now are in Russia, and how many of them are able to escape. And also, very often this is a financial question, because people have to pay to have, in order to get a queue, in order to get faster, sometimes through filtration, in order to get from one geographic point to another, people are paying money. And we also heard testimonies of some people in the newly occupied areas of Ukraine that were able to pay money to escape filtration. So sometimes there are also positive stories when, you know, Russian military and their accomplices were willing or agreed to, were willing to take money. But we also know cases when people needed money to get to the European Union from the occupied parts of Ukraine via Russia. And many people just don't have money and they're stuck in the Russian Federation. So this is a very important, grave problem that Ukrainians are facing.
Maryana, I want to say that thanks to the work that you and your colleagues are doing, you are recording various war crimes that are being committed contemporaneously. Unlike World War II, when had to wait till the end of the war for people to recognize the genocide that was taking place, right, in the concentration camps and the gas chambers. You are providing evidence of ongoing war crimes as they are happening. And this is why I thought this discussion was so important, because sometimes we hear stories and there are reports intermittently, but there's not as much ongoing reporting. You mentioned, as we said, there are different war crimes being committed. And of course, we've heard about the mass graves that have been found. And I think you mentioned that you have a video, right, that covers this topic.
Yes, we have a video. Our correspondent, Maryana Drach, went to Kharkiv region after it was liberated by the Ukrainian forces, and he saw a mass grave with both military and civilians. And let's watch that video from Izium.
Кладовище Ізюма, і навколо мене всі ці хрести дерев'яні з номерами. Це поховання людей, які померли або загинули під час російської окупації цього міста. Власне, тут ховали і, окрім цивільного населення, ховали і військових Збройних сил України. Знайдено могилку, де братська могила така собі, де поховано 17 солдатів, і там ще одна могилка, де ще Збройні сили, там так і написано ВСУ. Власне, і знайшов я тут теж сімейний такий могильник, які загинули в одну дату. Тут дуже багато людей гинуло під час авіаударів і під час обстрілів. Власне, всі їх тут теж ховали, тих, кого вдалося дістати.
Тут є відео, воно тут у нас, де було це поховання. Ми знайшли це відео, нам ніхто про нього не казав, ми його знайшли. Також у нас, коли тут ще був зв'язок, ми спілкувалися з місцевими, бо я сам місцевий, я народився в місті Краматорську, довгий час прожив в Слов'янську. Ось, з 10-го року я проживаю в Києві. Ось, але в мене є розуміння, хто тут, де, як. Я знаю людей, які тут залишалися і нам допомагали. І ми них запитували також, де знаходяться люди. Тут є, у нас є відео, ми так порахували, десь близько 20-25 людей. Хоча надпис тут був 17. Тобто ми перевіримо вже завтра, коли це будуть, вже тіла ці будуть підіймати. От, в Ізюмі в нас таких локацій дуже багато. Я маю на увазі Ізюмський район, це і Кам'янка, це і Довгеньке, де були бої. І сталося так, що ці тіла ми ще не забрали. Вчора ми вже відпрацьовували цю локацію, вчора, позавчора працювали, заважає нам дощ. Ми не можемо в деякі локації вийти, тим більше сапери у нас зараз на розрив, тому що розмінують територію, щоб люди могли спокійно ходити.
Nadia, I would like to add that UN commission that started working in Ukraine in May, it went to different Ukrainian regions, to Kyiv, Kharkiv, Sumy, and Chernihiv. It hasn't visited this specific site in Izyum, but it said that it was struck by the number of executions, and this is something, the Russian war crimes, this is something which is confirmed by international organizations. And right now there are efforts by the Ukrainian government, by the Ukrainian authorities, but also by the civil society to launch international tribunal. And we heard from Ukrainian officials, they recently said that they registered around 40,000 Russian war crimes. And I would like also to flag the initiative of the Ukrainian civil society when leading Ukrainian human rights groups, including Kharkivska Human Rights Group and others. They launched a special website where they try themselves to describe specific cases of alleged war crimes, including when the housing is destroyed by Russian shelling and other situations, other crimes, and they recorded around 20,000 of such crimes. So there are ongoing efforts, both from the Ukrainian government and from the civil society, to record such things.
Again, I have to commend you for this very important work that you're doing, because we know that the Kremlin's efforts for disinformation and propaganda are working overtime to try and deny the reality of what's going on, not only with their own people, but of course, throughout the world. And I think that the work that civil society is doing, journalists like yourself, and of course, the government of Ukraine, is forcing the international organizations and community to recognize and not hide from what is happening in Ukraine. It's so also important because we celebrate a lot of the gains that Ukraine is making militarily and recapturing, right, occupied territory, but we cannot allow that those successes to draw attention from these ongoing war crimes. I would like to ask one thing. We've talked about mass grave filtration and deportations. Can you say a few words about the children that have been kidnapped? I have been really struck by how little is being reported about children. I've mentioned in some speeches that in this country, when a child goes missing, there's what we call Amber Alert, where everybody, the law enforcement agencies are notified of any details. The media comes in, and then at times it's a countrywide search to find that missing child. In Ukraine, we've got hundreds of thousands of children that have been kidnapped. There are no Amber Alerts. And I really fear that we are putting reality to Stalin's words when he said, when one person is killed, it's a tragedy. When it's millions, it's just a number. And I'm afraid that right now those children are just a number. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I can remember one exact situation after a report from Izyum that we have seen now. It is a story of little girl, 9-year-old girl, and now she is in Russia because when Izyum was occupied by Russian army, this occupation administration took this girl to the summer camp or autumn camp. And then when the city was liberated, they did not locate her back. And her parents are in Izium now, and she is in Russia, and they have no connection with her. This is only one example of what can be. Really, you're right that it is about several hundreds, probably, of children who were kidnapped. According to Ukrainian presidential office, it was about 200,000 people. What it could be? First of all, different schools for orphans. These schools were, like Russians say, evacuated. It is a big amount of children, and they moved them to Russia. Then it were situations when, for example, parents were killed in Mariupol, and their daughter or son appeared in Russia, and even they were given for adoption. And there are many video reports on Russian TV when Russian families take these children and they travel to all the Russia. Nobody know where to look for them then, because this big country. Sometimes I know that Ukrainian Ministry of Occupied Territory, they have talks with Russian side in order to get back these children. And there are about 40 successful stories when people were got back. For example, 2 Mariupol children, because they have relatives in Ukraine. Their parents were killed, but they had, for example, grandparents who were able to take them. But of course, it is a very huge problem, and many children are really lost in Russia.
Yeah, it's my understanding that the Duma passed laws that these children can be given not only new names, new dates of birth, right? And even a place of birth. So completely obliterating their identity. It's just hard to comprehend. You say a couple of 100,000 children. But we will try to keep some focus on that. I'd like to remind everybody that if you'd like to ask a question, please submit it into the Q&A section. And let me see, I think we might have a question here. Excuse me, having a little challenge here. Well, okay, it's a comment from, thank you for sharing your dear colleague Vera's video. I was grateful also for bringing forth Ms. Bort's story, which connects the past and present. The Nazi Holocaust and history of Ukrainians are sometimes not familiar with. At this time, the Jewish High Holy Days, it brings honor to Jews who were slaughtered. May their and Vita's memory be for good. Yes, to Ms. Bott's message, speak up. Your wonderful journalists are heeding her call. Thanks from the bottom of my heart. And in the faith of humanity, from Boston, Massachusetts. Are there any other questions?
Thank you very much for your note, and for we are remembering Vera Heritage, and actually our company decided to dedicate the Online News Association award to the memory of our colleague who was killed. I would like to explain why Vera returned to Kyiv, because at that time, it was April, we recommended our journalists to relocate from Kyiv, but she decided to come back because her parents lived in Kyiv region after they survived Russian occupation. So she returned back to Kyiv and to Kyiv region to see her parents. And this is why she returned back to the city, and then she was killed by the Russian airstrike. But thank you very much for your kind note. It is very important for us, and it is important for Vera's family.
Sure. Maryana, you mentioned that there have been 40 journalists that have been killed during this war.
Yes, both as civilians and also at the front lines.
So what is your next, are you working on some current video stories that we might look forward to that you can tell us about?
I can tell you that of course, the top story in Ukraine over the weekend is what has happened in Liman, the strategic town in eastern Ukraine that Ukrainian army was able to recapture. So we are trying to get there and to film it. It is important because after Russia announced annexation of Ukrainian territories last Friday, this is the city that was recaptured by the Ukrainian forces. So it is very important for us to see what is happening there. Also, there is one ongoing story which we broke recently in Ukraine, and this is a developing story about Russian citizenship of a high-ranking Ukrainian judge. Bogdan Lvov is his name. And according to the Ukrainian law, he cannot have such a high position in the Ukrainian legal system. And today, the Security Service of Ukraine confirmed that he has Russian citizenship, which is not allowed if you are a judge. And so this is an ongoing story, and we hope to report more on this, because it is important to see. Of course, our main focus is what is happening in terms of what Russia's aggression is definitely top story for all our correspondents across platforms. But we also would like to continue monitoring events in Ukraine. So this is another story, and of course, NATO's aspiration by Ukraine decided to apply for NATO membership. We know that not everybody is happy to see Ukraine's bid, and this is what we are discussing today. What are the prospects, and how many years it may take for Ukraine to join NATO? This is something which is discussed. But also, you would not be surprised, but this is something that is not easy to see. That Ukrainians on social media, but not only on social media, discussing the nuclear threat. And we know recent statements by some of the Russian regional leaders like Kadyrov, who said that after Ukraine took over Liman, that Russia should employ a tactical nuclear weapon. And this is the ongoing story on social media, but also discussed by mainstream media in Ukraine, what to do if something like this happens. So this is not a threat. This is something which is discussed as not a theory. This is something which is discussed by Ukrainians as something that how to prepare and what to do if something like this might happen. But also, because we have been discussing today humanitarian issues, the big story for Ukrainians, of course, is upcoming winter, and how Ukrainians will be able to not to survive, but how to bear with harsh weather. And there have been statements from Ukrainian officials warning citizens that they have to be ready for harsh winter, including from the mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, who urged citizens to prepare warm clothing, and there are different preparations by city authorities across Ukraine for winter. So this is, I think, very important. And I think that Tetiana can tell more about what is done specifically in eastern Ukraine, because in some of the towns and villages in eastern Ukraine, there is no heating. So, and the local authorities are trying to arrange some mobile facilities. They're buying generators. And this is, I think, a big effort of regional administrations to prepare for the winter. So we are definitely covering this and preparing video explainers to people what experts recommend what to do. If you have a private house, it's one thing. If you live in a private residential building, that's something else. So this is something to watch in the country. And Tetiana, I think that would like to add something.
Yeah, Tetiana.
Yeah, really, in the eastern Ukraine, heating was one of the reasons why Ukrainian authorities recommended people to evacuate. First reason was the risk of occupation, and the second was heating, because in winter there will not be heating in most of houses, and evacuation is taking part maybe till spring. And surprisingly, we saw people regularly who do not want to leave their homes. They are very afraid, especially elder people, but also younger and with little children. Our colleagues who work in the front line regularly see parents with little children there, and they ask why you are staying here, because shelling take place every day. It is dangerous, but people are afraid to leave homes, to live somewhere without their homes. What about heating? Really, I know that local authorities have some plans how to organize some mobile heating centers for if winter will be very cold. So in some days, maybe in cities like Slovyansk or Kramatorsk, people can gather in heating stations, but in order it would be real, most of residents need evacuate, because if all residents will be in the city, they could not use this station for so many people.
So you should know that we at the U.S. Ukraine Foundation, in terms of our humanitarian work, have launched a fundraising initiative for winter is coming and helping people of Ukraine survive the winter and providing life necessities like food, water, shelter, and of course heating. And we're working with several organizations that are on the ground to provide those kinds of efforts. And so just know that there are also organizations here in this country that are mobilizing to help with the situation. But it is very, very dire.
I agree, and I would like to add that just to put this into perspective, that this war is very costly for the Ukrainian economy. And I heard statements from the Ukrainian government that it costs about $5 billion a month to keep essential services. And I think that it will be difficult for the country, even though Ukraine, is still waging a war. It is a tremendous task to rebuild the country, and this will cost a tremendous amount of money. I think that we can be lost in billions, but I remember that after 6 months of war, so like five weeks ago, there were calculations by the Kiev School of Economics. So they said that the war damaged, that the cost of the war was like $110 billion. And the Ukrainian government said recently, the Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal said that the cost of rebuilding the country will be $750 billion. So we're talking about tremendous cost. And I think it is important, and this is very important, to remember about not only big figures, but also average people and people that are suffering today and tomorrow. And because we don't know when and how Ukraine will be able to get international support for all the costs to pay for the social services and eventually to rebuild the country. But I have also, Nadia, if I may, I would like to say that there are very positive examples how Ukrainians are trying to, their grassroots initiatives to help people in need. So people are gathering information about elderly and other people in social media and trying to help them. There were such initiatives, I remember very well, in Kyiv in the early months of the Russian full-fledged invasion. So I think that such things are extremely important, because we are talking not only about general numbers, but about specific individuals that need such support. And our correspondents in Eastern Ukraine, like Serhiy Gorbatenko, Tetiana works with him closely. He often recorded people, civilians, their evacuation, their everyday life, and how they're trying to survive without electricity, without power. And I'm sure that this support will be and is very important, and we'll try to cover initiatives to help such people.
Yeah, I think, Maryana, the task is just of such magnitude that I think it's going to take everybody's to partake in addressing it, whether it's the government level, but I also think Ukraine's civil society has always been at the forefront responding to the needs of the people of Ukraine. And I think it behooves us in the private sector here in the United States and other parts of the world to be supportive and working in partnership with civil societies, different organizations, which is what we are trying to do. I know I don't want to, I mentioned a couple, but I'm going to miss some, but like Kyiv Rotary International, they're focusing on outfitting shelters. There's organization, I guess, Donbas and others. So this is where our focus is, to partner with local organizations in different regions. We're talking to organizations in Kharkiv. So we're all going to try to do our part to help. In terms of questions, there have been several, obviously, congratulating you on the work that you are doing. Marta Farion asks, how are international reporters working in these areas? Because you have a Ukrainian background, are they able to get into these regions?
In terms of getting to the regions, yes, reporters are able to get to the regions, but there are limits, of course, and there was a ban for about 2 weeks for local reporters or international media, most international media as well. So we did not have access for about 2 weeks, but that period of time coincided with the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kharkiv region and Kherson region, which is ongoing counteroffensive. And right now, there are a lot of correspondents that work in Ukraine, both Ukrainian and international journalists. And the latest stats that I saw is that 11,000 journalists, but also in this 11,000, we also can count drivers, fixers, and support staff are accredited with the Ukrainian government to cover the war. So this is an immense figure, 11,000. And in terms of access, it is not easy. But we are able to cover. And one of the things is that I think that people, I'm very proud of our colleague Marian Kushnir, who is able to report from front lines, and he is able to report stories that nobody else is able to report. And he's extremely brave, courageous. And he recently received an Order of Merit from President Zelensky for his reporting. The same with Serhiy Gorbatenko that I mentioned previously. He also received an Order of Merit. And this is this is something that we have to value, people that risk their lives to report such stories, but also journalists are working next to front lines, talking to civilians. And Ukraine is present, as far as I understand, in major international media. It is maybe no longer a top story of the day, but it is still covered. And some of the international media recently opened their offices in Kyiv, which is good. We know that for many years, for 30 years, they were reporting from Moscow. So I think it is good if international media are starting to report from Kyiv.
Yes. There's a question here about regarding the kidnapped children. Is anything being done or can be done by the Red Cross and the UN?
Frankly speaking, in Ukraine, there are many critics to the Red Cross because, as usual, Ukrainians think that Red Cross should make more for these humanitarian corridors and also for kidnapped children. They founded mission in Rostov region of Russia, and there was a statement that the idea is to help those people who evacuate Russian territory, but I didn't hear some news about returned children. Of course, it would be great if Red Cross would help more with that.
You have greetings from Louis Majdanek, thanking you for the work that you're doing. He says you are heroes, and he expresses grief for the children, and he ends with Slava Ukraini. There's a question here. When did the Russian policy change in Kherson that originally allowed people to go to Western Ukraine?
This is about mobilization.
I guess, no, about allowing people to evacuate to Western Ukraine.
I know exactly that they have restriction for men younger than 35 years, but also Ukrainian general staff stated a few days ago that Russian administration totally stopped this crossing through checkpoint from southern occupied south to other Ukraine. I don't know exactly it is stopped totally or not, because it is a long way, and our journalists in Zaporizhia need to see by her eyes whether these people still are coming, because the biggest hub for evacuated is in Zaporizhia. They all come there and then to other regions.
Maryana, I don't know if you answered this directly. There's a question here whether international media reporters are allowed to enter the occupied regions of Ukraine.
Yes, we see, for instance, Reuters is reporting from occupied regions, like from so-called Donetsk People's Republic.
But it is quite dangerous because, for example, RFRL journalists who worked there, they are all hidden. They do not put their names under reports. And maybe you know the story of our journalist Stanislav Aseyev, and writer. He was captured for more than 2 years because Russian administration turned out his journalist activity. So it is very dangerous for journalists.
So we cannot report, for instance, our newsroom cannot report openly from occupied territories of Ukraine. We have correspondents that report without their names mentioned. So this is what is happening. This is how we work. And Tetiana mentioned the case of our freelance journalist, Stanislav Aseyev. He was sentenced in 2017 to 15 years for so-called espionage. And then 2 years later, he was exchanged in the prisoners exchanged, and he became a famous writer. And he described his experience in prison. He spent 2.5 years behind bars in Donetsk. And he is already publishing his second book in the United States. And he will be, I know that he's coming to Chicago in November, and he will be presenting his book. It's called Torture Camp on Paradise Street, and it is published by Harvard University Press. So this is my promo of the upcoming event in Chicago, and I think that his testimony is very important. And recently, Stanislav Aseyev won the top literary prize in Ukraine for his stories from Donetsk, and he reported for RFRL, but also some other prominent Ukrainian media about life after the so-called Russian world came to Donetsk, Korlivka, and other towns in eastern Ukraine. And in my view, he's a very astute observer, and there's a very good, there were some reviews that has a very good literary work as well. So please Google that name, Stanislav Aseyev. And
well, we were
yes.
actually honored to host him for the presentation of his first book.
Okay.
So perhaps we can also do something with this upcoming book. Our time is really up, but I will, if everybody will indulge us, is there anything, Crimea? We haven't, I don't think, had any time to discuss what's going on in Crimea. Are there any highlights or things that you would just like to share with us before we conclude?
In terms of Crimea, I think the situation in Crimea has changed because right now Ukraine is talking more actively about deoccupation of Crimea, and this is something which is perceived as a more realistic scenario. I mentioned here Nariman Jalal, Crimean Tatar activist and journalist who was sentenced. And he was convicted. One of the reasons why he was convicted, according to the view of his lawyers, that he participated a year ago in the summit, in the inaugural summit of the Crimean platform in Kyiv. And this year, there was the second summit of the Crimean platform, and President Zelensky read a letter of Jalal from behind bars, and he said that everything has started in Crimea and it will end in Crimea. So this is the quote of Nariman Jalal, and maybe the answer to your question. So there is a hope that there is a hope in Kyiv. Of course, we're not talking about any like timelines, but there is a strong hope in Kyiv that Crimea will be deoccupied.
I may add that in the military sense, as we see, Crimea is a big military base for Russia, and everybody have understood this in last years, that they prepare it like military base. But Ukrainian army had several successful strikes by MLRS given by Western partners, and destroyed some number of aviation and other weapons. And the second important point about Crimea is that human rights activists stress that Russia tries to mobilize Crimean Tatars. They have a target to mobilize Crimean Tatars more than other citizens in Crimea.
Okay. Well, again, thank you very much. I hope that we can have another discussions sometime soon again to discuss your very, very important work. And our thoughts and prayers are with you. Slava Ukraini.
Heroyam Slava, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.